They laughed when the veteran inherited nothing but a worthless rock, until his German shepherd started digging and revealed a secret hidden for decades. When Ethan Walker sat in a small Wyoming lawyer's office to hear his grandfather's will, his family expected him to get nothing. And they were right. At least, that's what they thought. While the others took the money, the ranch, and the land, Ethan was left with only a lonely mountain rock and a German shepherd named Shadow. The room filled with laughter. But days later, deep in the silent Wind River Mountains, Shadow began digging at that very rock. And what he uncovered would change everything. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this story from today? The wind outside rattled the tall windows of the small law office in Lander, Wyoming. It was the kind of dry mountain wind that carried dust down from the Wind River Range and pressed quietly against the glass like it had something to say. Inside the room, the air felt stiff. Ethan Walker sat at the far end of a long wooden table, shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded together in front of him. His posture looked calm, but the muscles in his neck were tight. Years of military discipline had trained his body to sit still, even when his mind was racing. Across the room, the rest of the family spoke in low voices. They had not seen Ethan in years. Most of them were pretending they didn't notice him. Some of them weren't pretending at all. Ethan was 36 years old. Broad shoulders, weathered face. The kind of quiet expression that came from seeing too much of the world before most people had even left their hometown. He had spent 12 years in the United States Marine Corps, 2 tours overseas, too many nights that never quite left his head. Now he was back in Wyoming, sitting in a lawyer's office that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, waiting to hear what his late grandfather had left behind. At the front of the room, Attorney Margaret Collins adjusted her glasses and opened a thick folder. "Thank you all for coming," she said. Her voice was calm and professional, the kind of voice that had delivered many wills before. Ethan's cousin Bradley leaned back in his chair with a faint smile. Bradley Walker wore a pressed button-down shirt and a silver watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. He had the confident posture of a man who already believed he knew how this meeting would end. Bradley owned most of the family ranch operations now. He had always been the one the family trusted with money and land. Ethan had been the one who left, the one who went to war. Margaret Collins cleared her throat. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Walter Henry Walker." At the mention of the old man's name, the room fell a little quieter. Walter Walker had lived alone for almost 20 years up in the mountains. Some people in town called him stubborn. Others called him brilliant. Most simply called him strange. Margaret began reading. Several properties were mentioned first. The main ranch, the cattle operation, a few bank accounts. Each one passed directly to Bradley Walker. Bradley's smile slowly widened. Ethan watched the table. He had not come expecting much. His grandfather had never been the type to talk about money. But the old man had understood Ethan in ways the rest of the family never had. Walter Walker had been the only person who never asked Ethan why he seemed distant. The only one who didn't tell him to move on. The lawyer turned another page. "There is one additional inheritance to be addressed." Bradley glanced up with casual interest. Margaret looked directly at Ethan. "This portion is assigned to Mr. Ethan Walker." Several heads turned. Bradley raised an eyebrow. Margaret read carefully from the page. "To my grandson, Ethan Walker, I leave the property known as Iron Ridge, the rock formation and cabin located on the north slope of Wind River Range." The room stayed silent for 1 second. Then Bradley let out a short laugh. Iron Ridge. Everyone in the family knew what that was. A useless outcrop of granite halfway up a mountain where nothing grew and no cattle grazed. Bradley leaned forward. "That old rock?" he said. "You're serious?" Margaret continued reading. "Along with the property, I leave the German shepherd known as Shadow." Someone near the door snorted. Another relative shook his head. Bradley chuckled again. "So Ethan gets a rock and a dog," he said lightly. The laughter around the table spread. Not loud, but enough. Ethan kept his eyes on the wooden surface in front of him. The grain of the table looked like the dry riverbeds he had seen overseas. Margaret continued. "There is also a written note attached to this section of the will." She unfolded a small sheet of paper. The room grew quiet again. She read the single sentence written in Walter Walker's steady handwriting. "Iron Ridge belongs to the only man in this family who understands the meaning of a silent watch." Ethan slowly lifted his head. The words landed differently for him than they did for the others. A silent watch. That was not a rancher's phrase. That was military language. The kind spoken between soldiers standing guard in the dark when everyone else was asleep. Ethan felt something shift quietly in his chest. Bradley scoffed. "Granddad always liked his little riddles." The meeting ended soon after. Papers were signed, chairs scraped across the floor. Family members left the office talking about cattle prices and land surveys. No one asked Ethan what he planned to do with Iron Ridge. No one seemed to care. Outside, the Wyoming sky stretched wide and pale above the town. The mountains stood far away on the horizon like silent gray giants. Ethan stepped out of the office building and paused on the sidewalk. The dry wind moved through the street again. Behind him, the door opened. Margaret Collins stepped outside holding a leather leash. At the end of it stood a large German shepherd. The dog's coat was dark and thick, with deep brown eyes that watched everything carefully. "This is Shadow," Margaret said. She handed Ethan the leash. The dog did not pull. It simply looked up at Ethan quietly. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Shadow stepped forward and sat calmly beside him, like a soldier taking his place. Ethan looked toward the distant mountains. Somewhere up there waited a useless rock the entire family had laughed about. A rock his grandfather had protected for decades. And somehow, the old man had believed Ethan would understand why. The wind carried the scent of pine from far away. Shadow's ears twitched toward the mountains. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. For reasons he could not explain yet, it felt like something up there was still waiting. Ethan stood on the sidewalk for a long moment after the others had driven away. The town of Lander moved around him like nothing unusual had happened. A pickup truck rolled past. A woman carried groceries into a small shop. Somewhere down the street, a screen door slammed. Life was moving forward. But Ethan felt as if he were standing still. Shadow sat quietly beside him, the leash loose in Ethan's hand. The dog's ears shifted now and then, listening to the distant sounds of town life. Cars, voices, wind brushing the street signs. The dog looked calm, more calm than Ethan felt. He glanced down at Shadow again. "You came with the rock, huh?" Ethan murmured. Shadow simply looked up at him. The dog didn't wag his tail or bark. He just watched Ethan with steady attention. That gaze felt strange, almost familiar, like the look a soldier gave another soldier during a long night watch. Ethan finally turned toward his truck. It was parked along the curb, an aging blue Ford with scratches across the door and dust on the windshield. He opened the passenger door and nodded once toward the seat. Shadow climbed in without hesitation. No excitement, no confusion, just quiet obedience. Ethan slid behind the wheel and started the engine. The truck rattled to life the way it always had. For a moment he just sat there with his hands on the steering wheel. His mind drifted back to the words from the will. A silent watch. The phrase had followed him all afternoon. It meant something specific in the Marines. It meant standing guard while the rest of the unit slept, listening, watching, staying alert even when the night stretched endlessly quiet. It was the kind of duty only trusted soldiers were given. Ethan exhaled slowly. His family had laughed, but his grandfather had not been a man who wrote things lightly. Ethan pulled the truck into traffic and drove toward the edge of town. The buildings slowly thinned. Stores became houses. Houses became open land. Soon the road stretched wide between fields of dry grass bending under the Wyoming wind. The mountains waited far ahead, tall, gray, silent. Shadow shifted slightly in the seat. Ethan noticed the dog watching the mountains through the windshield. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "That's where we're headed." But the road home first led somewhere else. A small rental cabin just outside town. Ethan had been staying there since he returned from his last deployment 2 months earlier. It was nothing more than a single-room structure beside a gravel road, surrounded by a few cottonwood trees and a rusted fence. Not much, but quiet. And quiet was something Ethan needed. The truck pulled into the dirt driveway. Shadow stepped down from the passenger seat and immediately walked the perimeter of the yard. The dog's movements were careful and deliberate, nose low to the ground, ears turning toward every sound. Ethan leaned against the truck and watched. Most dogs wagged their tails when they arrived somewhere new. Shadow didn't. The dog was working. After a few minutes, Shadow returned and sat beside the cabin door. Guard position. Ethan gave a faint smile. "You've done this before," he said. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of pine boards and old coffee. Ethan set his duffel bag on the table and poured himself a glass of water. His body felt tired, but the kind of tired that never quite turned into sleep. Sleep had been difficult since he came home. Some nights he managed 2 hours, some nights less. Sometimes the memories arrived without warning. The sudden echo of distant explosions, the weight of desert heat, the feeling of standing watch in darkness with nothing but silence and the sound of your own breathing. Ethan sat down at the small kitchen table. Shadow settled beside the chair. The dog stayed close, not demanding attention, just present. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck and looked toward the window. The mountains were faint shapes on the horizon now as the sun began to sink lower. Somewhere up there was Iron Ridge, and a rock the entire family thought was worthless. He reached down and rested his hand on Shadow's head. The dog leaned slightly into the touch. "You know something I don't," Ethan said quietly. Shadow blinked slowly. Evening settled across the valley. The sky turned deep orange behind the distant mountains. Ethan eventually stretched out on the narrow bed beside the window. Shadow curled up near the door. For a while, everything stayed peaceful. But sometime in the night, Ethan's breathing changed. His hands clenched. The dream arrived the way it always did. Sudden, violent. Gunfire echoing through narrow streets, the thunder of explosions. A voice shouting orders in a language that wasn't English. Ethan's body reacted before his mind could separate memory from reality. He sat upright in the dark, breathing hard. The room was silent. The war was gone. but his heart was still racing. Shadow was already there. The dog stood beside the bed, pressing his nose gently against Ethan's hand. No barking, no panic, just calm pressure. Ethan focused on the sensation, the warmth of the dog's breath, the steady rhythm of Shadow's breathing. Slowly, Ethan's pulse began to settle. "Easy," Ethan whispered to himself. Shadow remained beside him until the tension finally faded. After a while, Ethan leaned back against the wall. The window showed only darkness outside, but he could still imagine the mountains beyond it. Iron Ridge, his grandfather's strange inheritance, a rock, a cabin, and now this dog. Ethan looked down at Shadow. "Guess it's just you and me," he said quietly. Shadow rested his head on Ethan's knee. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the tension in his chest loosen just a little. Somewhere far beyond the town lights, the Wind River Mountains stood silent beneath the stars, waiting. And neither Ethan nor Shadow yet understood that the real reason his grandfather had left that mountain to him had nothing to do with the rock at all. Morning arrived slowly over the Wyoming Valley. A pale blue light stretched across the sky while thin clouds drifted above the distant Wind River range. Frost clung to the grass outside the cabin, sparkling quietly in the first touch of sunlight. Ethan stepped out onto the small wooden porch with a mug of black coffee in his hand. The cold air hit his lungs sharply. Shadow followed him outside, already alert. The dog paused on the porch, nose lifted toward the wind. For several seconds, he stood perfectly still, listening. Then Shadow stepped down from the porch and began walking slow circles around the yard, inspecting the ground, the trees, the fence line. Guarding. Ethan watched him for a moment. "You don't miss much, do you?" he said. Shadow continued his quiet patrol. The dog moved with calm purpose, not like a pet, but like something trained, something disciplined. Ethan leaned against the porch railing and looked toward the mountains. They were clearer this morning, huge walls of gray stone rising above endless pine forests. Iron Ridge was somewhere up there. The thought lingered in his mind. His grandfather had spent the last 20 years living in those mountains alone. Not many people would choose that kind of life, but Walter Walker had never been like most people. Ethan finished his coffee and walked back inside the cabin. He grabbed a folded map from the kitchen table. The property lines had been marked by the county years earlier. Iron Ridge sat nearly 40 miles into the mountains, beyond the last paved road. Getting there would take most of the day. Ethan looked down at Shadow. "Well," he said, folding the map, "guess we should go see what Granddad thought was so important." Shadow's ears lifted slightly, as if he understood. An hour later, the truck was loaded. Ethan packed tools, blankets, a small cooler, and his grandfather's old compass he had found years ago in a box of family belongings. Shadow jumped into the passenger seat again without hesitation. The engine roared to life. They pulled onto the highway heading north. The town disappeared quickly behind them. Soon the road narrowed into a long stretch of asphalt, cutting through wide open land. Brown grass rolled across the plains in slow waves, while the mountains grew larger on the horizon. The farther they drove, the quieter the world became. Eventually, the pavement ended. Gravel replaced it. The truck bounced along a winding road that climbed slowly into the forest. Tall pines closed around them. Sunlight filtered through the branches in shifting beams. Shadow sat upright the entire time, eyes scanning the woods. Every once in a while, his ears twitched toward some distant sound Ethan couldn't hear. An hour later, the road became little more than a narrow dirt trail. Ethan shifted the truck into four-wheel drive. The climb grew steeper. Rocky slopes rose beside them, while deep forest valleys stretched below. The mountains felt different up here. Older, heavier, as if they were holding on to secrets. By early afternoon, Ethan finally saw it. A weathered wooden sign leaning beside the trail. The faded paint still spelled two words: Iron Ridge. The truck rolled past it slowly. The path continued another mile before opening into a small clearing high on the mountainside. And there it was, the cabin. It looked even older than Ethan expected. The wooden boards were gray with age. One corner of the roof sagged slightly. Pine needles covered the ground around the structure like a soft carpet. Behind the cabin, the mountain rose sharply in a wall of granite. A massive stone ridge towered over everything. Ethan shut off the truck engine. Silence immediately filled the clearing. Not city silence, mountain silence. The kind that felt deep and endless. Even the wind seemed to move more carefully here. Shadow jumped down from the truck and began exploring the clearing. He circled the cabin first, then moved toward the tree line. His movements were careful, focused. Ethan grabbed his duffel bag and stepped toward the old building. The wooden porch creaked under his weight. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust, old pine, and faint traces of wood smoke. A stone fireplace sat against the far wall. Simple furniture filled the room. A table, two chairs, a narrow bed. Everything looked frozen in time, as if Walter Walker had just stepped outside and never returned. Ethan set his bag down. His eyes moved slowly across the room. Every object felt intentional. His grandfather had been a careful man.
Nothing here looked abandoned. It looked preserved.
Shadow stepped inside behind him. The dog walked through the room slowly, nose moving across the floor, the walls, the corners. Then Shadow paused. His gaze lifted toward the fireplace. The massive stone structure rose from the floor to the ceiling. The stones were large and rough cut. One in particular stood out. A darker slab near the base. Shadow stared at it quietly. Ethan noticed. "What is it?" he asked. The dog walked closer, sniffed the stone once, then turned away and continued inspecting the room. Ethan shrugged and began opening windows to let fresh air inside. Outside, clouds were slowly gathering over the mountain peaks. A faint wind brushed through the pine trees. Hours passed as Ethan worked. He cleared dust from the floor, fixed a loose cabinet door, stacked wood near the fireplace. The physical work helped. It always did. Movement quieted the restless parts of his mind. By evening, the cabin looked livable again. Ethan stepped outside onto the porch. The sky had turned deep orange over the mountains. Shadow sat near the edge of the clearing watching the forest. Still alert, still listening. Ethan leaned against the railing and looked up at the towering ridge behind the cabin. Iron Ridge. A rock his entire family believed was worthless. But standing here, feeling the weight of the mountain and the strange quiet surrounding it, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that his grandfather had known something no one else did. The wind moved gently through the trees. Shadow suddenly turned his head toward the mountain wall behind the cabin. His ears lifted. The dog stared at the stone ridge for several seconds, as if listening to something deep inside the mountain itself. Ethan followed his gaze. The granite wall loomed above them in the fading light. Cold, silent, unmoving. But for a brief moment, Ethan thought he felt something too. Not a sound, not exactly. More like the faintest vibration beneath the ground. Then it was gone. Shadow remained perfectly still, watching the mountain, as if waiting. And somewhere deep inside that wall of stone, something ancient and hidden had just begun to wake. Night settled slowly over Iron Ridge. The last orange light faded behind the peaks, and the mountains turned dark blue beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. Far below the ridge, the forests stretched endlessly across Wyoming, silent except for the whisper of wind through pine branches. Ethan stood on the porch a little longer, staring at the granite wall behind the cabin. Whatever strange feeling had passed through the ground earlier was gone now. The mountain looked exactly as it had before, still, silent, immovable. He shook his head once and stepped back inside. The cabin was warmer now, with a small fire burning in the stone fireplace. The flames moved gently across the stacked wood, casting soft shadows along the wooden walls. Shadow entered behind him and immediately resumed his quiet patrol. The dog walked through the room once, then twice. Nose low, ears alert. Every movement controlled. Ethan watched from the table where he had placed a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. "You've done security work before," he muttered. Shadow paused near the door. The dog looked toward Ethan briefly, then returned his attention to the windows. Outside, darkness pressed against the glass. Ethan finished eating and leaned back in the chair. The fire cracked softly, and the warmth slowly filled the small room. For the first time since arriving, Ethan felt something unusual. Peace. No traffic, no distant noise, no sudden sounds that made his nerves jump. Just wind and firelight. He rubbed his eyes. Maybe the mountains were good for him. Maybe his grandfather had known that. Shadow finally settled near the doorway, lying down but keeping his head lifted. Watching. Listening. The hours passed slowly. Ethan cleaned the dishes and added another log to the fire before stretching out on the narrow bed against the far wall. The mattress was thin but comfortable enough. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing through the pine trees in long, sighing waves. For a while, Ethan simply watched the firelight flicker against the ceiling. Then exhaustion pulled him into sleep. At first, the night remained quiet. But sometime after midnight, Ethan's breathing grew uneven. The dream came suddenly. Desert heat, gunfire echoing through narrow streets, the flash of distant explosions, the sound of shouting over radios. Ethan's body tensed instantly. His muscles tightened as if preparing to move. He turned sharply on the bed. His hand gripped the edge of the mattress like it was a rifle. The memory felt real. Too real. Then something warm touched his wrist. Ethan's eyes snapped open. Shadow stood beside the bed. The dog's nose pressed gently against Ethan's arm. No barking, no panic, just quiet contact. Ethan took a slow breath. The cabin slowly came back into focus around him. Wood walls, firelight, the mountain outside. He exhaled again. "Yeah," he whispered. Shadow remained beside the bed until Ethan's breathing steadied. Only then did the dog step away and return to his position near the door, watching. The fire crackled quietly. Ethan lay awake for several minutes. The dream had faded, but the tension still lingered in his chest. He looked toward the doorway where Shadow sat. The dog hadn't moved, just listening, almost like he knew exactly when Ethan needed him. "You're not much for sleeping, are you?" Ethan murmured. Shadow's ears twitched slightly, but the dog stayed where he was, guarding. Ethan eventually closed his eyes again. This time, the sleep that came was deeper. Outside, the mountain wind shifted direction. Clouds slowly gathered above the peaks. By early morning, a thin layer of snow dusted the clearing around the cabin. When Ethan finally woke, gray light filtered through the windows. Shadow was no longer by the door. The dog stood near the fireplace instead, staring at the stone structure. Ethan pushed himself upright. "Morning," he said quietly. Shadow didn't respond. His attention remained fixed on the fireplace. Ethan swung his feet to the floor and stretched. The cabin felt colder now that the fire had burned low overnight. He added another log and crouched beside the hearth. That was when he noticed it. Shadow wasn't just looking at the fire. He was watching the stones, the large granite blocks that formed the fireplace wall. One of them sat near the base, a darker slab, wider than the others. Shadow leaned closer, sniffed once, then pulled back slightly. Ethan frowned. "You smell something?" The dog glanced toward him briefly, then turned back to the stone again. Ethan stood up and walked over. He ran his hand along the rough surface of the fireplace. Cold granite. Solid. Nothing unusual. "Probably mice," Ethan said. But Shadow didn't move away. The dog stayed there another minute, studying the stone. Then, slowly, he stepped back and returned to the door, as if he had simply made note of something. Ethan stared at the fireplace a little longer. The stone looked ordinary, just part of the old cabin structure. He finally shrugged and moved on to make coffee. Outside, the snow clouds thickened across the mountain sky. Wind rolled down the ridge in cold waves. By afternoon, the storm would arrive. And before the night was over, Shadow would make it very clear that the stone in that fireplace was not part of the cabin at all. The storm arrived faster than Ethan expected. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the heavy gray color that only mountain weather could produce. The wind came down the ridge in cold gusts that rattled the cabin windows and pushed loose snow across the clearing like drifting sand. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily, casting warm light across the wooden floor. Ethan sat at the table, cleaning an old lantern he had found in one of the cabinets. It was the kind his grandfather probably used for decades before electricity reached the mountains. Shadow lay near the door, quiet but alert. Every so often, the dog lifted his head toward the fireplace, watching, listening. Ethan noticed it more than once. "You're still thinking about that rock," he said. Shadow's ears twitched slightly, but the dog didn't move. The storm grew stronger as evening approached. Snow began to fall harder, tapping against the windows and swirling across the porch outside. By nightfall, the mountain was completely hidden behind thick clouds. The world beyond the cabin had disappeared. Ethan added another log to the fire and stretched his shoulders. The long drive and the work around the cabin had left his muscles tired. But it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from real work. Shadow suddenly stood up. Not slowly, not casually. The dog rose with sharp focus and turned toward the fireplace. His body stiffened. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" Shadow took 2 steps toward the stone hearth. Then he stopped. His nose lifted. The dog sniffed the air once, twice. Then his posture changed. Low, alert. The way a trained working dog moved when something felt wrong. Ethan set the lantern down. "What do you hear?" Shadow approached the fireplace carefully. The dog lowered his head toward the large granite stones forming the base of the hearth. His nose hovered near the darker slab Ethan had noticed earlier. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Shadow began scratching. At first, it was slow. One paw against the stone, then another. The scratching sound echoed faintly in the cabin. Ethan stood up. "Hey," he said. Shadow scratched again, harder this time. The dog let out a low growl. Ethan walked closer. "Shadow, easy." But the dog ignored him. The scratching became faster, more desperate. His claws scraped against the stone with sharp, urgent sounds. "Shadow!" Ethan grabbed the dog's collar and gently pulled him back. The German shepherd resisted for a second before stepping away. But he didn't calm down. Instead, he circled back toward the fireplace immediately, his tail stiff, his breathing quick. Ethan frowned. "What in the world?" Shadow lunged forward again. This time he scratched furiously at the base of the stone slab. The sound echoed loudly through the room. Claw against granite, over and over. The dog's nails scraped so hard Ethan could hear them splintering. "All right." Ethan stepped forward and knelt beside the hearth. "Let's see what you're so worked up about." He ran his hand along the surface of the stone. Cold, rough, solid, just like every other rock in the fireplace. Ethan tapped it with his knuckles. Nothing unusual. But Shadow continued to growl softly beside him. The dog's nose stayed inches from the stone, as if something beyond it held his complete attention. Ethan leaned closer. He ran his fingers along the edges of the slab. That was when he noticed something strange. The stone didn't feel completely flush with the others. The gap along one side looked slightly wider. He pressed his palm against the slab and pushed. Nothing. It didn't move. Ethan sat back on his heels. "You're telling me something's behind this thing?" Shadow gave a short bark. Ethan looked toward the tool chest he had brought earlier. Inside was a small crowbar. He grabbed it and returned to the fireplace. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's try something." He slid the metal edge of the crowbar into the thin crack between the darker slab and the surrounding stones. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Ethan pushed down. The metal bar creaked. The stone shifted, just a fraction. Ethan froze. Shadow's ears snapped forward. "Hold on." Ethan pushed harder. The slab moved again. This time the grinding sound of stone sliding against stone filled the room. Snow hammered harder against the windows outside. The wind howled across the ridge. Ethan braced his foot against the hearth and pulled the crowbar downward with both hands. The granite slab lifted, slowly, heavier than he expected. When it finally tipped forward onto the floor with a dull thud, cold air rushed up from beneath the fireplace. Ethan stared. Where the stone had been, there was now a square opening in the floor. Not dirt, not rock. Steel. A metal chamber hidden beneath the hearth. Shadow immediately leaned forward and sniffed the opening. The dog's growl faded into quiet breathing, as if the mystery he had sensed was finally revealed. Ethan grabbed the lantern and lowered it toward the chamber. The yellow light illuminated a narrow compartment lined with dark metal. Inside were several objects wrapped carefully in oilcloth. A small leather notebook, a folded map, and something else. A strange metal key, old, heavy, military-looking. Ethan slowly reached inside and lifted the notebook. The cover was worn but intact. On the first page, written in steady handwriting, were 2 words: Walter Walker. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs slowly. His grandfather hadn't just left him a rock. He had hidden something beneath it, something he clearly never wanted the rest of the family to find. Shadow finally stepped back from the hearth. The dog sat down beside Ethan. Quiet again. Mission complete. Ethan looked down at the key in his hand, then at the notebook, then back at the dark opening beneath the fireplace. Outside, the storm continued to rage across Iron Ridge. But inside the cabin, a far greater storm had just begun. Because whatever his grandfather had hidden beneath that stone was only the beginning of the secret buried inside this mountain. The storm roared outside the cabin as Ethan slowly lifted the leather notebook from the metal chamber. Snow slammed against the windows in gusts that made the old wood creak. But inside, the firelight flickered steadily across the room. Shadow remained beside him, calm again now that the hidden space had been opened. The dog watched the opening beneath the fireplace one last time, then quietly lay down near Ethan's boots. Ethan brushed dust from the notebook with careful fingers. The leather was worn smooth by years of use. The edges were slightly cracked, but the binding still held together. This book had been opened many times. He turned the first page again. Walter Walker. The handwriting was unmistakable. Ethan remembered that handwriting from letters his grandfather used to send him while he was overseas. Short letters, few words, but every sentence had meant something. He turned the page. The first entry was dated nearly 30 years earlier. Ethan pulled the chair closer to the fire and began to read. The storm outside faded into the background as his grandfather's voice slowly came alive through the words. My name is Walter Henry Walker. If you are reading this, it means you are the one I trusted with Iron Ridge. Ethan paused. He felt an odd tightness in his chest. He continued. The others would never understand this place. They see only land, cattle, money. But the mountain is something different. Ethan glanced toward the wall of granite outside the cabin. The storm wind howled down the ridge. He returned to the notebook. During the Cold War, I worked as an engineer for a naval research program. Our task was simple in theory but impossible in practice. Detect movement beneath the ocean floor before anyone else could. Ethan leaned forward slightly. He had never known this about his grandfather. To the rest of the family, Walter Walker had simply been a rancher who preferred solitude. But the notebook told a different story. Most people think sonar only works in water, but rock carries vibration just as well, sometimes even better. Ethan turned another page. Several rough sketches filled the paper. Lines of mountains, arrows, numbers, scientific notes written in small, careful writing. The ridge above this cabin amplifies seismic and acoustic waves. The shape of the granite acts like a natural receiver. Ethan slowly looked toward the stone wall outside again. He remembered the strange vibration he thought he felt earlier. Had that been real? He read on. The government abandoned the research after funding cuts. They believed the system would be too expensive to build. The next page contained a simple sentence. They were wrong. Ethan's eyes moved faster now. The notebook described years of work, experiments, measurements taken from the ridge. Walter Walker had spent nearly 2 decades studying the mountain. Then Ethan reached the page that made his breath catch. I built it myself. The following pages contained detailed diagrams, underground chambers, equipment layouts, signal pathways. Ethan stared. "This can't be," he whispered. Shadow lifted his head at the sound of his voice. Ethan continued reading. Inside the mountain behind the cabin is a monitoring station. It can detect vibrations across hundreds of miles of terrain and ocean floor. The next sentence was underlined. It was never meant to be a weapon, only an early warning. Ethan leaned back in the chair slowly. His grandfather hadn't just studied Iron Ridge. He had built something inside it. Something large enough to require diagrams this complex. Ethan looked down at the metal key he had removed from the chamber. The key suddenly made much more sense. He flipped to the final section of the notebook. The handwriting had grown slightly shakier in the last pages. "I knew the family would never understand. Bradley would sell the mountain the first chance he got." Ethan exhaled quietly. His grandfather had known exactly how things would unfold. Only a soldier understands the meaning of a watch that never ends. Ethan felt those words settle deeply in his chest. The last page contained a simple instruction. "Behind the cabin you will find a wall of granite covered with moss. The door is hidden there. The key opens it." Ethan closed the notebook slowly. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller. Outside, the storm raged harder than ever. The mountain loomed just beyond the walls. And somewhere inside that mountain, there was an entire hidden station. Shadow stood up and walked toward the cabin door. The dog's ears tilted toward the storm outside. Ethan followed his gaze. "You hear something?" Ethan asked. Shadow didn't bark, but the dog remained focused on the direction of the ridge. Ethan walked to the window. Through the blowing snow, he could barely see the massive wall of granite rising behind the cabin. Somewhere in that wall was the door his grandfather had written about. Ethan looked down at the heavy metal key resting in his palm. The storm would make exploring tonight impossible, but tomorrow morning he would find that door. He turned back toward the fireplace and carefully placed the notebook on the table. Shadow returned to sit beside him. The fire crackled quietly. Ethan ran his hand across the dog's head. "You knew something was there," he said softly. Shadow's tail moved once against the floor. Outside, the storm began to settle slightly. Snow continued to fall across Iron Ridge, covering the mountain in white silence. But Ethan could no longer see the mountain the same way. It wasn't just a ridge of rock anymore. It was hiding something enormous, something his grandfather had spent half a lifetime building. And somewhere beyond that granite wall, a door waited. A door that had been closed for decades. And by this time tomorrow, Ethan Walker and the dog who had discovered the secret would be the first ones to open it. Morning came slowly to Iron Ridge. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the entire mountain buried under fresh snow. The clearing outside the cabin glowed pale and quiet beneath a sky washed clean by wind. Ethan stepped onto the porch just after sunrise. The air was sharp and cold enough to sting his lungs. Every breath turned into a cloud in front of him. Shadow moved ahead of him, paws crunching through the powdery snow. The world felt different after the storm. Still, almost expectant. Ethan looked up toward the granite ridge rising behind the cabin. Somewhere in that wall was the door his grandfather had described. He tightened his coat and grabbed the metal key from his pocket. "Let's find it," he said. Shadow immediately began climbing the slope behind the cabin. The dog moved easily through the snow, weaving between rocks and frozen shrubs. Ethan followed, his boots digging into the fresh snow as he climbed. The granite wall grew larger with every step. Up close, the ridge looked even more massive than it had from the clearing. A towering wall of stone, scarred by time and weather. If Walter Walker had hidden something here, he had chosen a perfect place. Ethan walked slowly along the base of the ridge. The notebook had said the door would be hidden behind moss, but in winter, most of the moss was buried beneath snow and frost. Shadow moved ahead, nose low to the ground. The dog searched carefully along the rock face. Minutes passed. Then Shadow stopped. His ears lifted. The dog scratched lightly at a patch of snow against the stone wall. Ethan stepped closer and brushed the snow away with his gloves. Beneath it, the rock looked different. The granite surface wasn't smooth like the surrounding stone. It was flat. Too flat. Ethan knelt down and cleared more snow away. Slowly, the shape revealed itself. A tall rectangle carved into the rock. The edges were nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. But now that the snow was gone, there was no mistaking it. A door. Shadow stepped back and sat beside him, watching quietly. Ethan ran his hand along the cold metal surface. The door was coated with a thin layer of rock dust and moss that had grown over it for years. But beneath that, it was unmistakably steel. His grandfather had hidden an entire entrance inside the mountain. Ethan found the lock a few inches above the center of the door, a small keyhole. He took the metal key from his pocket. For a moment he hesitated. 30 years. That was how long the notebook suggested this place had been sealed. Whatever was behind this door had been waiting a very long time. Shadow watched him calmly. Ethan finally inserted the key. The metal slid into place with a solid click. He turned it. At first, nothing happened. Then a deep mechanical sound echoed through the granite. The door released with a heavy groan. Ethan pulled. The steel slab slowly opened inward. Cold air rushed out from the darkness inside the mountain. Not the cold of winter, a deeper chill. The kind that came from underground stone untouched by sunlight. Ethan stepped back slightly. The opening revealed a narrow corridor carved straight into the rock. Metal rails lined the walls. Old electrical lights hung from the ceiling. And somehow, they were still glowing faintly. Shadow moved first. The dog stepped cautiously across the threshold, ears forward. Ethan followed. The air inside smelled faintly of metal and dust, but it did not smell abandoned. Some systems were still running. Somewhere deeper inside the mountain, a low humming sound vibrated through the stone. Ethan walked slowly down the corridor. The tunnel stretched forward about 30 yards before opening into a much larger chamber. When Ethan stepped into that room, he stopped completely. The chamber was enormous. Banks of old computer consoles filled the space. Rows of metal cabinets lined the walls. Screens, large, thick glass monitors from another era, covered the central control station. Some of them flickered with dim green light. Others remained dark. Thick cables ran across the floor and disappeared into the rock walls. Shadow walked ahead, paws echoing softly across the metal flooring. The dog sniffed the air, then sat beside one of the consoles, as if waiting. Ethan approached slowly. His eyes moved across the equipment. Sonar arrays, signal receivers, mapping displays. Even without turning anything on, he could see what this place had been built for. His grandfather hadn't exaggerated. This was a monitoring station, a listening post hidden inside the mountain. Ethan stepped toward one of the screens. Dust covered most of the controls, but one display still glowed faintly. A map slowly moved across the glass. Lines pulsed outward like ripples on water. Signals. Ethan stared. The machine was still alive. After all these years. He looked around the chamber again. Walter Walker had built this place alone, piece by piece, hidden from everyone. The realization sent a chill through Ethan. His grandfather hadn't just been protecting a mountain, he had been guarding something far bigger. Shadow suddenly stood up. The dog turned toward the entrance corridor. His ears lifted sharply. Ethan noticed the change instantly. "What is it?" Shadow remained completely still, listening. Then the dog gave a low, warning growl. Ethan turned toward the tunnel behind them. At first he heard nothing. Then, far away outside the mountain, a faint sound carried through the winter air. The distant rumble of an engine. Someone was coming up the trail. And whoever it was, they had no idea that the secret of Iron Ridge had just been opened. The low rumble of the engine drifted through the mountain air like distant thunder. Inside the underground chamber, Ethan stood still, listening. Shadow's growl deepened slightly. The German shepherd had already moved closer to the corridor entrance, his body angled toward the outside world. Ethan stepped quietly to the tunnel and looked back toward the steel door. Daylight spilled faintly through the opening. Snowflakes drifted through the air beyond it, and beneath the quiet of the mountain, the sound came again. An engine, climbing slowly up the trail. Ethan's jaw tightened. "No one comes up here by accident," he muttered. Shadow gave a short, low bark. Ethan took one last look around the underground station. Banks of old machines hummed quietly. Dim screens glowed with faint signals, pulsing across maps that stretched far beyond the mountain. His grandfather's secret. And now, someone was driving straight toward it. Ethan moved quickly back through the corridor. Shadow stayed right beside him. When they stepped outside the steel door, the cold mountain air rushed over them again. The sky had cleared completely. Sunlight reflected sharply off the snow, lighting the entire ridge in bright white. Ethan pulled the steel door closed behind him and brushed snow across the seams where the opening had been. From a distance, the wall of granite looked exactly the same again. Nothing unusual, nothing visible, just stone. Shadow remained alert, staring down the slope toward the trail. A few seconds later, the sound became clearer. A truck. Heavy tires grinding slowly through snow and rock. Ethan moved quietly down the hill toward the cabin clearing. He didn't like surprises, and right now, the mountain had just revealed a secret worth protecting. When Ethan reached the edge of the clearing, the truck came into view. A dark pickup pushed through the final bend of the trail and rolled into the open space near the cabin. Ethan's stomach tightened. He recognized the vehicle instantly. Bradley Walker stepped out of the driver's side. Ethan watched from the trees. Bradley looked exactly the same as he had in town, perfectly groomed, clean boots, expensive coat. Behind him, two other men climbed out of the truck. Neither looked like ranchers. Both wore heavy jackets and carried themselves with the stiff confidence of men used to rough work. One of them glanced around the clearing carefully. The other walked toward the cabin porch. Bradley smiled slightly when he saw the cabin door standing open. "Well, well," Bradley said loudly. "Looks like our cousin made himself comfortable." Ethan stepped out from the tree line. Shadow moved beside him instantly. Bradley turned. His smile widened. "Ethan," he said, "thought we might find you up here." The two hired men turned toward Ethan as well. Their eyes moved quickly between him and the dog. Ethan crossed his arms slowly. "Didn't expect visitors." Bradley shrugged casually. "I was in town going through Granddad's old financial records." He nodded toward the mountain behind the cabin. "You know he spent a fortune maintaining this place?" Ethan didn't respond. Bradley continued walking slowly across the clearing. Snow crunched beneath his boots. "Millions of dollars over the last 20 years, he said. Bradley stopped a few feet away. "That's a lot of money for a useless rock." Shadow stepped slightly in front of Ethan. The dog's posture changed. Low, protective. One of the hired men noticed and smirked. "Nice dog," he said. Ethan kept his eyes on Bradley. "What do you want?" Bradley slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "I'm curious," he said calmly. Granddad wasn't crazy. He wouldn't dump money into this mountain without a reason. He glanced toward the ridge. "Something's up there." Ethan remained silent. Bradley smiled again. "You find anything interesting yet?" The wind moved through the trees. Shadow's ears twitched. Ethan knew Bradley well enough to understand the real meaning behind the question. This wasn't curiosity. It was greed. Bradley leaned closer. "You see, Ethan, I think Granddad hid something valuable up here." One of the hired men walked toward the fireplace stones inside the cabin. He glanced around the room briefly. "Place looks recently cleaned," the man said. Bradley nodded slowly. "Exactly." His eyes returned to Ethan. "So here's how this works," Bradley said quietly. "If there's something hidden on this property, it belongs to the family." Ethan shook his head once. "The will says otherwise." Bradley's smile faded slightly. "Don't be difficult." Shadow growled. Not loudly, but enough. The sound carried across the clearing like a warning. The hired men paused. Ethan rested his hand gently on the dog's back. "Shadow," he said quietly. The dog remained ready but stayed beside him. Bradley studied the German shepherd carefully. "That animal seems protective," he said. "He's trained," Ethan replied. Bradley's eyes narrowed. "You always did have a habit of guarding things," Bradley said. He looked toward the ridge again. "Question is, what exactly are you guarding now?" Ethan met his gaze. "Nothing you need to worry about." Bradley chuckled. "Oh, I think it's exactly something I need to worry about." The wind picked up again across Iron Ridge. Clouds began gathering once more over the distant peaks. Bradley turned back toward his truck. "We're staying the night," he said casually. "Storm might roll back in." He glanced at Ethan. "And tomorrow morning, we're going to take a look around that mountain." Ethan watched them unload equipment from the truck. Bradley wasn't leaving. Not now. Not when he believed something valuable was hidden here. Shadow sat beside Ethan again. The dog's eyes followed every movement Bradley's men made. The mountain stood silent behind them. But Ethan knew something Bradley did not. The secret of Iron Ridge was real. And if Bradley discovered it, the quiet watch his grandfather had kept for decades would be over. Evening settled slowly across Iron Ridge. The temperature dropped as the sun slid behind the distant peaks, and the wind that followed carried the sharp warning of another storm. Ethan stood near the edge of the clearing, watching Bradley and the two men unload gear from the back of the truck. They worked with the casual confidence of men who believed they already owned the mountain. Bradley directed them like a foreman. "Tent goes over there," he said, pointing toward the far side of the clearing. One of the men nodded and began setting up a portable heater beside the truck. The other carried a metal case toward the porch. Ethan noticed the case immediately. Tools. Heavy ones. Shadow stood beside Ethan, his gaze never leaving the strangers. The dog's body remained low and tense, the thick fur along his back slightly raised. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's neck. "Easy," he murmured. Shadow remained still, but his eyes followed every movement Bradley made. Bradley eventually walked back across the clearing toward Ethan. The fading daylight cast long shadows across the snow. "You're welcome to stay in the cabin," Bradley said, his voice almost polite. Ethan gave a small shake of his head. "I'm fine." Bradley looked toward the ridge behind the cabin. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "we start looking." Ethan didn't answer. Bradley smiled faintly. "You know something's up there." The wind pushed through the trees again. A cold gust carried loose snow across the clearing. The first flakes of the new storm began to fall. Bradley turned and walked back toward his men. Within an hour, darkness covered the mountain. The storm arrived with it. Snow swept across Iron Ridge in thick waves, erasing the last signs of the trail that had brought Bradley here. Inside the cabin, the fire burned brighter now. Ethan sat quietly near the window. Shadow lay beside the door again, alert. Through the glass, Ethan could see Bradley's camp lantern glowing faintly through the blowing snow. They weren't leaving. Not tonight. Not until they found whatever they believed was hidden here. Ethan leaned back in the chair. The notebook lay open on the table. His grandfather's words still echoed in his mind. "Only a soldier understands the meaning of a watch that never ends." He understood now. Walter Walker hadn't just built a secret station. He had been guarding it for decades. And now Ethan had inherited that responsibility. A sudden crash outside shattered the quiet. Shadow sprang to his feet instantly. Ethan grabbed his coat and stepped onto the porch. The wind nearly knocked the door from his hand. Snow blasted across the clearing. Through the storm, he saw movement. One of Bradley's men was shouting near the truck. "Rock slide!" the man yelled. Ethan looked toward the ridge. For a split second, he saw it. A section of the slope above the cabin had broken loose. Snow and rock tumbled downward through the darkness. The mountain itself was shifting. "Get back!" Ethan shouted. But the wind swallowed his voice. The rumbling grew louder. Shadow suddenly bolted past him. The dog raced across the clearing straight toward Ethan. For one brief moment, Ethan didn't understand why. Then Shadow slammed into his legs with full force. The impact knocked Ethan sideways. They both fell into the snow. A heartbeat later, a massive rock crashed down exactly where Ethan had been standing. The ground shook. Snow exploded across the clearing. Ethan pushed himself upright, heart racing. Shadow limped slightly beside him. The dog's front leg trembled. Ethan grabbed the dog's collar. "You all right?" he whispered. Shadow didn't answer, of course, but he leaned against Ethan's side. Another rumble rolled down the slope. Smaller rocks bounced across the snow. Bradley and his men ran toward the cabin, shouting over the storm. "What the hell was that?" Bradley yelled. "Slide from the ridge," Ethan said. The wind howled louder now. Snow thickened until the world beyond the clearing disappeared completely. The mountain had turned dangerous. Bradley looked up toward the slope again. "We can't stay out here," he said. Ethan glanced toward the granite wall behind the cabin. He knew something Bradley didn't. There was a place safer than the cabin, the underground station. But bringing Bradley down there meant revealing the secret. Ethan looked at Shadow. The dog's injured leg trembled slightly, but he still stood ready. Another rock crashed somewhere in the darkness above them. Bradley cursed. "Inside!" he ordered his men. They rushed toward the cabin. Ethan hesitated for only a moment. Then he made his decision. "This place isn't safe," Ethan said loudly. Bradley turned back. "What are you talking about?" Ethan looked toward the mountain wall. "There's shelter inside the ridge." Bradley frowned. "What?" Ethan didn't explain. He simply started walking through the snow toward the granite wall behind the cabin. Shadow followed beside him despite the limp. Bradley and the two men exchanged confused glances. Then they followed. The storm roared around them as Ethan brushed snow from the hidden door. Bradley stared when the steel outline appeared in the rock. "What is that?" he asked. Ethan pulled the key from his pocket. His grandfather's secret was about to become much bigger than he ever intended. The lock clicked. The steel door opened once again. Cold air rushed out from the hidden corridor. Bradley stepped forward, eyes wide. "Good Lord," he whispered. Behind them, the mountain continued to rumble under the storm, and as the 4 men and 1 injured German shepherd stepped into the hidden station beneath Iron Ridge, Bradley finally realized something terrifying. The worthless rock he had laughed about in town was worth far more than he had ever imagined. The steel door closed behind them with a heavy echo. For a moment, no one spoke. The corridor inside the mountain stretched ahead under dim yellow lights that hummed quietly overhead. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust, the way old machine rooms often did. Bradley stepped forward slowly, staring down the tunnel. "What is this place?" he whispered. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Shadow limped beside him, the injured leg still shaking slightly, but refusing to slow him down. The dog stayed close to Ethan's side, watching the strangers carefully. Behind them, the storm roared outside the sealed door. Inside the mountain, everything felt strangely calm. Bradley's 2 hired men moved cautiously down the corridor, their boots echoing softly against the metal floor. Then the passage opened into the main chamber. The moment Bradley saw the room, he stopped. "Holy," he breathed. The underground station stretched wider than the cabin above it. Rows of heavy consoles filled the space. Old radar-style screens flickered faintly across the central control desk. Thick cables ran along the walls like veins feeding the machinery. Some systems were still alive. Green lights blinked slowly across several panels. Bradley walked toward the center of the room, turning slowly in a circle. "This isn't a cabin," he said quietly. "This is a facility." Ethan remained near the entrance. Shadow lowered himself onto the floor beside him, though the dog's eyes never stopped tracking Bradley's men. One of the men approached a console and brushed dust from the surface. "Looks military," he muttered. Bradley's eyes lit with a different kind of energy now, not curiosity, calculation. He turned toward Ethan. "You knew about this." Ethan crossed his arms. "I just found it yesterday." Bradley smiled thinly. "Sure you did." He walked toward one of the glowing monitors. Lines moved slowly across the screen like waves. "What does it do?" Ethan hesitated. Then he answered simply, "It listens." Bradley looked back at him. "To what?" Ethan stepped closer to the control station. "The ground, the ocean, movement underground." He pointed toward one of the displays. "My grandfather built a seismic and acoustic monitoring station." Bradley's expression sharpened. "You're telling me this thing tracks signals underground?" "Across hundreds of miles," Ethan said. The room fell quiet. Bradley's hired men exchanged glances. One of them gave a low whistle. That kind of system would be worth serious money. Bradley didn't look away from the monitors. That's exactly what I was thinking. Ethan felt the tension shift instantly. The mountain was no longer just a curiosity to Bradley. Now it was opportunity. Bradley turned toward him slowly. You realize what this means. Ethan's voice remained calm. It means my grandfather was smarter than anyone in this family believed. Bradley shook his head. No. He tapped the console lightly. It means this technology is worth millions. Shadow growled softly. Bradley glanced down at the dog. Relax, he said. But Ethan's eyes had already moved to the screens again. One of the monitors had changed. The slow wave pattern had begun to pulse faster. A small red indicator blinked in the corner. Ethan frowned. That wasn't there earlier. He leaned closer to the display. Numbers scrolled across the screen. Coordinates, signal strength. Something was moving, deep underground. Shadow stood up again immediately. The dog's ears locked forward. Ethan adjusted a control dial. The monitor zoomed out to show a larger map. Bradley stepped beside him. What are we looking at? Ethan studied the data. A drilling signal, he said slowly. Bradley blinked. What? Industrial equipment, Ethan continued. Something powerful. He traced the signal path with his finger across the map. It's coming from the north. Bradley frowned. That's miles away. Ethan nodded. But it's heading this direction. One of the hired men leaned over the console. You're saying someone is drilling toward this mountain? Ethan didn't answer right away. The signal grew stronger on the screen. The machine beeped softly as new data arrived. Shadow moved closer to Ethan again. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the blinking monitor. Bradley suddenly laughed quietly. Well, that's interesting. Ethan looked at him. Bradley's expression had changed again. You see, Bradley said, I may have made a few calls after looking through Granddad's records. Ethan's stomach tightened. What kind of calls? Bradley leaned against the console casually. Investors. The word hung in the air. One of the hired men glanced at Bradley with surprise. You didn't tell us that. Bradley shrugged. Didn't seem important at the time. Ethan stared at the screen again. The drilling signal continued approaching slowly. Who did you call? Ethan asked. Bradley smiled faintly. People who are very interested in technology like this. Ethan felt the weight of the situation settle heavily in his chest. Bradley hadn't just come here to investigate. He had already begun selling the secret. Shadow gave a deeper growl. The machine beeped again. The signal grew stronger. Closer. Bradley looked toward the glowing screens with excitement.
Looks like your grandfather built something very valuable, cousin.
Ethan turned to face him fully now. This station was meant to protect people. Bradley shrugged. Protection can be profitable. Another alert flashed across the monitor. Ethan adjusted the controls quickly. The machine translated the signal pattern into a location. The coordinates appeared clearly on the screen. Bradley leaned forward. Well, he asked. Ethan's voice was quiet. They're less than 50 miles away. Bradley smiled. Then I guess they'll be here soon. Shadow stepped closer to Ethan again. The dog's injured leg trembled, but he refused to sit. The mountain above them groaned softly under the weight of the storm. And deep beneath the earth, Something was moving closer to Iron Ridge. Something Bradley had invited. Something Ethan now understood could turn his grandfather's quiet watch into a battle for the mountain itself. The signal on the monitor pulsed again, a steady rhythm, like the slow heartbeat of something enormous moving through the earth. Ethan stood motionless in front of the console, his eyes fixed on the glowing coordinates. 50 miles. The distance felt both far and dangerously close. Bradley leaned against the steel edge of the control station, arms folded, watching the screen with quiet fascination. "Well," he said calmly, "looks like the guests I invited are on schedule." Ethan turned toward him. "You invited them to drill into this mountain?" Bradley shrugged. "I told them there might be something worth looking at." "You told them about this place?" Bradley smiled slightly. "I told them enough." Shadow stepped closer to Ethan again, his injured leg trembling with the effort of standing. The dog's ears remained pinned forward, watching Bradley and the two men carefully. One of Bradley's hired men shifted uneasily. "You didn't say anything about foreign contractors," the man said. Bradley's smile widened.
You didn't ask. The room grew quiet again, except for the low hum of the machines. Outside, the storm battered the mountain with growing force. Snow slammed against the sealed door far above them. The station lights flickered once. Ethan looked down at the console. Another alert blinked across the screen. A different one this time. Incoming transmission detected. Ethan's heart tightened. The station was receiving something. Bradley leaned closer. "What is it?" Ethan tapped a switch. A static-filled signal poured from the speakers. Broken fragments of radio chatter echoed through the chamber. Then a voice cut through the noise. Unclear. Foreign. Bradley's eyes lit with interest. "See?" he said softly. "My partners." Ethan shut off the speaker immediately. The silence afterward felt heavier. "They're not your partners," Ethan said quietly. "They're buyers." Bradley shrugged again. "Same difference." Ethan stared at the console. His grandfather's words returned to him again. "If the watch is ever broken, the wrong people will come." And they already had. Shadow suddenly shifted his weight. The dog looked toward the far wall where another panel had begun flashing red. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. A warning signal blinked on the system display. Seismic pressure increasing. The storm outside had triggered deeper movement inside the ridge. The mountain itself was unstable. Ethan quickly scanned the readings. "We've got another problem," he said. Bradley frowned. "What now?" The rock slide earlier loosened part of the ridge. Ethan pointed at the graph climbing across the screen. "If those drilling machines get any closer tonight," the line spiked. "This entire slope could collapse." One of the hired men cursed under his breath. "You're saying the mountain could bury us?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." Bradley stared at the screen. For the first time since arriving, the confidence in his expression began to fade. "How long?" Bradley asked. Ethan studied the numbers. "Hard to say." Shadow suddenly stepped forward again. Despite the injury, the dog limped toward another console near the wall. His nose touched the panel. A soft alarm beeped again. Ethan followed. "What is it, boy?" The display above the console showed something new. A blinking communication light. Ethan frowned. "This channel." He flipped a switch. Static filled the speakers again. Then another voice broke through. Clearer this time.
Unidentified station on Iron Ridge. The message repeated slowly. This is United States Army Search Command. Identify yourselves. Bradley's eyes widened. The Army? Ethan stared at the radio. His grandfather must have installed an emergency beacon. The moment the station detected unauthorized signals underground, it had alerted someone. Bradley stepped back from the console. This wasn't part of the deal. Ethan picked up the microphone. This is Ethan Walker, he said calmly. I'm the registered owner of the Iron Ridge property. There was a brief pause. Then the voice returned. Mr. Walker, we received a classified seismic alert from your station. Ethan glanced at Bradley. That alert is accurate. Bradley's men exchanged worried looks. Ethan continued. We have unauthorized drilling activity approaching the ridge. I also have 3 individuals here who entered the site without clearance. Bradley snapped his head toward Ethan. You just made a big mistake. Ethan ignored him. The voice on the radio responded quickly. Understood. A response unit is already en route. Ethan felt a small wave of relief pass through him. How long? He asked. Approximately 40 minutes, weather permitting. Ethan looked toward the ceiling as the storm roared above them. 40 minutes. Bradley laughed quietly. You really think we're just going to sit here and wait for them? Shadow growled again. Bradley's 2 hired men stepped back slightly. They no longer looked confident. One of them spoke carefully. This job wasn't supposed to involve the Army. Bradley's voice hardened. Relax. But the room had already changed. The tension now felt like a drawn wire stretched too tight. The machines hummed. The storm pounded the ridge. And somewhere beneath the ground, the drilling signal continued creeping closer. Shadow limped back to Ethan's side. The dog lowered himself beside the console, guarding it despite the injury. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. For a moment, everything felt strangely calm again. The quiet watch. The responsibility his grandfather had carried for decades. Now it belonged to him. And as the minutes passed, Ethan and the wounded German shepherd remained standing guard inside the hidden station. Waiting. Listening. Watching the signals move across the screens. Until finally, through the storm outside, the distant thumping of helicopter blades began to echo across Iron Ridge. At first, it sounded like thunder. A slow, rhythmic vibration buried beneath the roar of the blizzard. Ethan lifted his head. Shadow did the same. The German shepherd's ears rose instantly despite the pain in his injured leg. His body stiffened as he listened to the sound traveling through the mountain itself. Thump. 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 Helicopter rotors. Bradley heard it too. He turned sharply toward the sealed steel door at the far end of the corridor. You called them faster than I thought, he muttered. Ethan didn't answer. He simply watched the radar screen in front of him. The signal representing the drilling machine underground was still there, slowly advancing toward Iron Ridge. But now another signal had appeared. Air traffic. Approaching quickly through the storm. The Army had responded. Bradley's hired men exchanged uneasy glances. One of them wiped his hands nervously against his jacket. This job is finished, he said quietly. Bradley's expression hardened. No, he said. It isn't. Shadow growled low in his throat.
Bradley ignored the dog and stepped closer to the control station. You really think they'll just take this place away from you? He asked Ethan. Ethan kept his eyes on the screen. "This station was never meant to belong to anyone," he said calmly. "It was meant to protect people." Bradley scoffed. "Everything belongs to someone." Outside, the thunder of helicopter blades grew louder. Snow blasted across the ridge above the station. The mountain trembled again. Another rumble echoed through the rock overhead. The seismic monitor flashed red once more. Ethan checked the readings quickly. The pressure inside the ridge was still unstable. "Everyone stay away from the outer corridor," Ethan said. "If the ridge shifts again, that section could collapse." Bradley's men immediately stepped back. Even Bradley hesitated. The power of the mountain was something no one in the room could control. The rotors above grew louder now. The entire station vibrated faintly as the helicopter circled overhead. Then the radio on the console crackled again. "This is Army Response Unit 7, the voice said. "Station Iron Ridge, do you copy?" Ethan picked up the microphone. "I copy. We have visual on the cabin and landing zone. Prepare to open your access point." Ethan nodded to himself. "Understood." He turned toward the corridor leading to the hidden door. Shadow slowly rose beside him. The dog's injured leg dragged slightly across the metal floor, but he followed anyway. Together, they walked down the narrow hallway. Behind them, Bradley and the others remained in the control room. Ethan reached the steel door. For a moment, he placed his hand against the cold metal. This door had protected his grandfather's secret for decades. Now the watch was changing hands. He turned the locking wheel. The heavy bolt slid open with a deep metallic clunk. Cold air rushed into the corridor as the door slowly opened. The storm howled beyond the threshold. Snow whipped across the mountainside in violent waves. Above the ridge, a military helicopter hovered against the wind. The aircraft lowered slightly toward the clearing beside the cabin. Spotlights cut through the snowstorm like bright blades of light. Within minutes, soldiers moved across the clearing toward the entrance. Their boots crunched across the frozen ground. One of them stepped inside the doorway and removed his goggles. "You Ethan Walker?" Ethan nodded. "That's me." The soldier glanced past him down the corridor. "Are there other individuals inside the facility?" "Yes," Ethan answered calmly. "They're waiting in the control room." The soldier gave a brief nod. 2 more soldiers followed him into the corridor. The rest secured the area outside. When they entered the chamber, Bradley stood perfectly still beside the console. His hired men had already raised their hands. The soldiers approached carefully. "Step away from the equipment," the lead officer said. Bradley exhaled slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like the watch is over." Ethan stood near the doorway with Shadow beside him. The officer turned toward Ethan. "You're the one who activated the emergency signal?" "Yes." The officer looked around the station. Then he gave a slow, impressed nod. "Your grandfather built something remarkable here." Ethan glanced at the screens one last time. The drilling signal beneath the mountain had already stopped. Whoever Bradley had contacted had likely seen the military response and withdrawn. The threat was gone. For now. The officer stepped closer. "We'd like to talk to you about maintaining this facility," he said. Ethan looked down at Shadow. The dog finally lowered himself to the floor, exhausted. But his eyes remained alert, still watching, still guarding. A faint smile crossed Ethan's face. "My grandfather kept watch here for decades," he said quietly. The officer nodded. "And it looks like he chose the right person to continue it." Months later, the storms of winter finally passed over the Wind River Range.
The old cabin had been repaired. New communication equipment had been installed inside the mountain. But the ridge itself remained unchanged. Wild, silent, endless. Each evening, Ethan Walker walked the perimeter of the clearing while the sun disappeared behind the Wyoming mountains. Shadow moved beside him, his leg fully healed now. The dog paused often to scan the forest, just as he had the very first night they arrived. Guarding, listening, watching. Far below the ridge, the quiet systems inside the station continued to monitor the deep movements of the earth. Most nights, nothing happened. And that was exactly the way Ethan preferred it. Because sometimes, the most important duty a soldier could have was simply standing watch. And on Iron Ridge, as the wind moved softly through the tall pine trees, two guardians continued that silent watch together. One man, and the German shepherd who had discovered the secret that changed everything. And maybe that's what this story is really about. Not the mountain, not the hidden station, not even the secret beneath the rock, but loyalty. Because sometimes, when the whole world laughs at you, the only one who still stands beside you is a dog who never stops believing. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you. Let's try something simple. Type 1 in the comments if you believe a loyal dog can change a person's life. Or type 0 if you think Ethan's story could never happen in real life. And if you're watching this from somewhere around the world, tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy stories about courage, loyalty, and the quiet strength of people who never give up, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the next story might be even more powerful. Another forgotten place, another secret waiting to be uncovered, another loyal dog standing beside someone who needs it most. And I'll see you in the next story.